From his desire to see the glory days of the octagon restored to some of the more controversial opinions he's voiced, here's why Joe Rogan thinks the UFC has gone soft. Take one look into any major MMA event from about 20 years ago, and one of the first things you'll notice is that a large portion of those fighters were truly jacked beyond all belief. A guy like Ken Shamrock just wouldn't exist under the USADA era of the UFC. It just doesn't happen. Ken himself has admitted to taking steroids, and if you surveyed a very honest group of mixed martial artists from that era, you'd find that a large majority of them would tell you the exact same thing. Do USADA help make the sport fairer? Well, sure, if you really want to believe that they're doing an effective job. But the truth is, for as much of an improvement as they are, many high-level fighters are managing to beat the system without any issues. And if you have money behind you and the right connections, getting past USADA is not as difficult as you might think. And Rogan seems to think the whole anti-doping movement isn't everything it's stacked up to be. On top of that, Joe will be the first to tell you that there's a major shift in the personality types that are drawn to fighting nowadays. MMA was once a sport of hard-nosed brawlers, the type of dudes you'd cross the road to avoid if you saw them on the street. These days, it's pretty fair to say that the clientele has become a little more diverse. Let's put it plainly, you wouldn't have seen a guy like Chase Hooper in the UFC 20 years ago. Hell, even guys like Sean O'Malley and Israel Adesanya, who openly love gaming and all things nerdy, they would have seemed out of place in the olden days. And don't get us wrong, that's not a bad thing. But for a guy like Joe who came up during the glory days, perhaps he sees the shift as something that makes the whole thing less appealing. And it's not just an aesthetic thing or a personality difference. No, it's pretty fair to say that the fighters themselves are a lot more cautious these days, a lot more calculated with their career trajectories. And again, that's a good thing. But for someone like Rogan, is it still as much fun as it once was? Well, we can only speculate, but perhaps not. For every guy like Shane Burgos or Brian Barberena, who will come in and put his health on the line every night, you have a fighter who refuses a fight unless conditions are perfect, or one who prioritizes a point-scoring technique to avoid damage. These days, we know a lot more about CTE and the dangers of MMA as a career path, and it certainly shows. With the UFC growing in popularity and under some major scrutiny for their practices, with many criticizing the level of pay they dole out for their fighters, champions and big-name talents who only fight once a year are getting more and more common. These fighters are more inclined to take ownership of their own careers and try to leverage what they have for their own benefit, even if it doesn't benefit the fans who would rather see them fight. That's a good thing. The UFC shouldn't be allowed to rule the roost in the way they once did, but even with that being the case, there does seem to be a different approach the fighters utilize these days. And sure, a lot of these things are good. They're morally right. Getting USADA in makes the sport fairer. You shouldn't be able to turn up to the cage jacked to the gills and expect to fight a guy who has never touched a PED in his life. That might not be the most exciting matchup you could possibly see, but it's a lot closer to the fairest. Rogan has jokingly said in the past that they should just let all athletes in MMA use steroids to even the playing ground. Now, that is a conversation for another time, but even if he is joking, you can just tell that Rogan misses the chaos of the old UFC days. That chaos brought us guys like Wanderlei Silva, Chris Laban, even the younger Robbie Lawler. Fighters who really embodied the whole just bleed mentality. These days, you kind of need to dilute any mystique you might have with 1,000,001 interviews and a social media presence. And if you're not committed to playing the game, you might just end up being incredibly underpaid and cast aside as the roster size swells. MMA back in the early 2000s was just a different world. It was certainly easier to follow, but it wasn't as accessible to the masses. And these days, Dana White is all about making a product that appeals to the most people possible. The earlier years of the UFC actively tried to poach that no-holds-barred market. But now the UFC is on ESPN. The sport is totally accepted by the mainstream, or at least the sporting world, And with crossover stars like Conor McGregor and Ronda Rousey, the doors have been kicked open. Joe has a place in that world, and his own fame has grown thanks to the UFC. But there's a trade-off, and Rogan appears to be very aware that things are not the same. On top of that, a lot of fans and even some of Joe's fellow analysts have voiced their belief that Rogan is slowly falling out of love with the sport. Or at the very least, he's not the super fan he once was. And it's not like you can really blame him. When Joe first got involved with the UFC, he was new to the sport. He wasn't a family man like he is now, and he didn't have burgeoning careers in comedy and podcasting to fall back on. Sure, he did have acting and stand-up gigs, but it wasn't like the thunderstorm of success he's dealing with these days. In those days, the UFC had a much lighter event schedule, a less crowded roster, and overall, it was just a lot easier to be a hands-on fan of the sport. If you were working in a commentary position, you likely knew every fighter on the roster to quite a decent level of detail. Not because the sport was less soft, but because there were less of them to get to know. And the rise of competing organizations like Pride and Strikeforce kept the UFC on their toes, constantly. These days, the roster is bloated, and the UFC product has been diluted beyond all belief. Due to the many events that come with the ESPN deal, too often, you see fans complaining about a fight night event with a pair of very mid-level fighters headlining. Who can blame Joe for not being as much of a fan? The man is the most successful podcast host on the planet. Either way, the hardcore fan base certainly seems to think that Joe has lost a step or two when it comes to calling fights from the commentary desk. And his lack of real connection to the modern game makes his work on the mic inconsistent, especially if it's not a massive fight. Maybe he's right in some ways, but there's definitely an angle here that can counter Joe's points by saying he's just not as invested. He recently had the legendary Baz Rutten on his podcast, a former pancrase and UFC heavyweight champion, who was a pioneer of the sport. And you could just see Joe's eyes light up with nostalgia as he spoke about the UFC in older days.
So many people kick the bag. No one has ever impressed me with a leg kick, a low kick on the bag like Pedro Hizzo.
Maybe he simply doesn't have that fire in him anymore. It's hard to keep yourself fully devoted to something for a long period of time, even if the money's good. And it does seem like Rogan is slowly losing interest. From his days as a hungry young commentator looking to make a name for himself, to his explosion as one of the most famous people on planet Earth, this has been a look at Joe Rogan's opinion on and relationship with the sport of MMA over the years.